The Institute started on the journey which led to this report in 2009, when Jonathan, in his former role in the Ministry of Justice, invited us to conduct a real-time evaluation of Transforming Justice, their major change programme. At the time, it was rare in scale and scope, planning ahead for a better justice system, whilst also aiming to make hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings. But now, the combination of the spending review and a radical reform in government has placed transformational demands on the whole of Whitehall. So we're in the midst of the biggest reduction in public spending since the end of the Second World War. On average, departments have been tasked with making reductions of 19% over 4 years, including at least a third reduction in administrative spending. And the stakes are high for the civil service, for the coalition and for the public more widely. But confounding the Sir Humphrey caricature, Whitehall has been taking the agenda head on. So in the last 2 financial years, we've seen billions of pounds worth of savings in central government. The civil service overall has downsized by over 54,000 posts in 18 months. It's now the smallest it's been since 1939. And many departments are fundamentally re-examining how they operate, not least the Ministry of Defence. But 2 years on from the spending review, Whitehall is now at a critical turning point. The successes in reducing costs and downsizing are hard won, but they need to be converted into long-term sustainable changes. So on the current scale, what we're saying is that change is not just a management issue, it's a leadership issue. So it's not just a set of programmes to be managed from start to finish. It's not just another round of cuts. It's not just another reorganisation or even a one-off crisis. All of those the civil service is used to and often excels at dealing with. Really, these are historic shifts which will go a long way to determining the future shape and capability of the civil service. And leaders right across Whitehall will bear a heavy responsibility. It can't just be left to those with transformation in their job title. Now, evidence suggests that 2 out of 3 private sector change programmes fail to achieve their aims, and there are good reasons to think that Whitehall will struggle at least as hard. So after a decade of rising budgets, there's limited top-level experience of leading change on this scale. Only 27% of staff think that change is led and managed well in their department, and tight controls mean that departments have pretty limited access to outside expertise. But most important, there's no roadmap for departmental leaders in the unique context that is Whitehall. And there's been no attempt to learn the lessons from departments' experiences so far of undergoing these major changes. And that's what this research attempts to bridge the gaps to. So we've worked very closely over several years, as Peter was saying, with a handful of departments. We've spoken to leaders in every single department across Whitehall, and we've also worked with an expert advisory group to help us too. Leading through this round of cuts and further rounds ahead is going to be extremely challenging. And in this report, 3 areas emerged in which the challenges are presented most dramatically. First, being able to set a positive direction for the future and being able to stick to it. So I mentioned Transforming Justice. It started in 2009, and it survived a change of government, a spending review, a change in the Director General, a change in the Permanent Secretary, and most recently the 3rd Secretary of State to be introduced. But it's the exception in how bold the department's been in setting out such a strong platform for change, and how deep-rooted the agenda's become in the department. But what's not exceptional is the level of turnover at the top. The challenge across departments really is dealing with an inherently unstable leadership team, and that's on both sides of the divide, with new ministers, permanent secretaries and directors general constantly shifting and keen to make an impression on their department. So ministerial tenure has increased from what was a pretty brisk 1.3 years under the previous government, but only 2 permanent secretaries are still in post, the same post they were in at the election, and some have moved more than once. Now that makes an extremely difficult environment in which to commit to a long-term direction of travel. And not only that, but we also know that the deficit won't be closed until at least 2016-17. So cuts and reform are virtually certain to outlast this government. Yet there are no formal mechanisms for building consensus or even for deepening the understanding of what's happening in Whitehall with the opposition. The second challenge is maintaining staff motivation and commitment. And we know that staff buy-in and commitment at all levels is vital to departments' capabilities in supporting new ways of working. But downsizing has taken place on an industrial scale in several departments, and staff often see a bleaker future ahead than when they joined, feeling that the psychological contract has been broken. And in that context, keeping the best staff and keeping them motivated and engaged is going to be extremely difficult. We've seen that gaps are already emerging between the rhetoric and the reality of change, which undermines its credibility in places. So the experience for many staff is that they're still doing similar work in similar ways, but working much harder to make up for the shortfall in lost colleagues. And there are gaps between the values that leaders set out and what actually happens in practice. So common statements like supporting staff to take more risks, rewarding collaborative behaviours, valuing backgrounds other than policy, were rarely felt to have become a reality. And there was one particular gap that came through, which was valuing our staff as the most important asset. We found only one department, which was DFID, which had really taken staff engagement and built it not only into promotion for senior civil servants, but also the appraisal system. Others, like DCMS, have recognised the value of groups like Human Resources and Internal Communications, which can play a critical role, supporting leaders and managers to have the right conversations with staff throughout. But we found that these examples were relatively few and pretty far between. And with the 2012 People Survey due out soon, it will be fascinating to see what they reveal about the state of the service. Now, the last challenge that I'll highlight is just about departments failing to work together. And it's really striking the degree to which change so far has been driven from within individual departments. Despite the scale of the cuts, there's been very little deep and substantive working across departments to make savings or introduce new ways of working. And in many ways, that simply reflects the long-standing state of affairs in Whitehall. But there's now a sense that the model is not just flawed, but at breaking point. And this round of cuts was described by one official as salami slicing with some great big chunks. But leaders across a number of departments were also clear that they'd reached what they thought was a threshold. And substantial further cuts would require making some pretty difficult decisions about what to stop doing or what to do completely differently in future. The only real opportunity left was to work much more effectively across boundaries. But that's going to require working far more innovatively and overcoming some of the deeply ingrained barriers. So the Institute's talked elsewhere about the need to do the next spending review very differently. But before then, and aside from that, departments will need to find ways to overcome the disincentives to investing to reduce costs elsewhere in government, or to reduce future costs where savings only accrue much further down the line. That's a major issue and obviously a recurrent one for the civil service. But it's also going to require political permission and support, particularly allowing departments to plan ahead before they get trapped in the next cycle of cuts. Now, we're still only at the beginning of a long road, so how transformational change is led and managed over the coming years will go a long way to determining whether the civil service emerges smaller in size and stature, or whether it emerges leaner and more confident and capable. This is basically our first attempt to establish what can be learnt so far and to clarify the key issues ahead. We're going to keep returning to this agenda over the years, and the changes underway will certainly be historic.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That was a very effective, and what I might say is just a summary of what is a very extensive and rich report bearing on the experience. Could I just make 2 points before introducing Jonathan? One, James mentioned the DFID. One thing we've done at the Institute is have an award called Inspiration for Government, which is nominated by the staff, which goes to innovative practice in government. And last week, Mark Lowcock and some of his team from DFID were here to receive this award for their internal communication. They managed to have, DFID is probably the most widely spread of government departments, rivaling the Foreign Office and where it is. Rivaling perhaps is the wrong word, complementing the Foreign Office where it is, but they managed to have all staff meetings in real time, and they communicated that way, and they were a really interesting example, and we hope to find more examples from transformation programs to which we can give awards to. The other thing I should say is if you want to get onto Twitter, the hashtag is civil service. We're very original tonight. Jonathan, you've experienced working with us, and we're very grateful for all the work you've done with us, but obviously at two very important departments.
Thanks very much. The summer before last, I made a switch from the role of Director General at the Ministry of Justice, Director General of Transformation and Corporate Strategy at the Ministry of Defence. And I think I might have been excused for thinking, as I made that switch, that the primary common denominator between the two roles, one in Justice, one in Defence, was the increasingly common use of the word transformation to make it more and more difficult to understand what civil servants do. Particularly as I went round the country looking at the challenges facing the department that I was arriving at, I found myself talking to Gurkhas on training, Salisbury Plain preparing for deployment in Helmand. I found myself in the captain's mess at HMS Vauntless, one of the most advanced destroyers in the world. I found myself talking to scientists at Porton Down, preparing to make sure that we were protected if anybody was so bold as to place anthrax at the Olympic Park. And I thought, what compares me for this challenge given the sort of role I was doing in justice with the prison service and trying to keep a lid on the legal aid budget. But fortunately I found an answer. Because as I looked underneath the surface at the nature of the transformation challenge in defence, what I found, for example, was an organisation employing tens of thousands of people in uniform, feeling a fantastic sense of institutional loyalty, joining the service from school or college and remaining in it for their life. A service in which we needed to reduce the number of people by about 20% while protecting its core values over the lifetime of a parliament. I could be talking about the army, or I could be talking about the prison service. And as I looked in more detail at the other sorts of challenges I've faced, I heard words like shared services, I heard words like digital, I heard words like the private sector. And I could have been talking to the army about the work they're doing to outsource their recruitment function to Capita, or the partnership we just put in place with Serco to deliver back office functions across the armed forces more efficiently than currently. I could have been talking about the work that we're doing to put the allocation of housing to service personnel online, or I could have been talking about the work we were doing when I was in Justice to introduce shared services to the courts. I could have been talking about putting courts online, virtual courts. I could have been talking about the outsourcing of Birmingham Prison to the private sector. And as I looked at the challenge of making the most efficient Ministry of Defence I possibly could, in what seemed at first sight to be the unique circumstance of an organisation co-led by a civil servant, permanent secretary, a non-civil servant, the Chief of Defence, where better to look for a comparison of the challenge and the opportunities than the court service, jointly led by a civil servant, Peter Hancock, and the Lord Chief Justice. So I was struck, and I've never been more struck by the nature of the problems and challenges that face us department by department being much more common than you would think, which is why I've always enjoyed working with the Institute for Government, because there's so much more that we can learn by working across boundaries than we at first appear. And that's why I've been such a supporter of Bob's approach to driving a corporate leadership through the civil service reform agenda. We are so much stronger if we work on these common challenges together than if we let departmental boundaries stand in the way. I was doubly pleased to be asked to work with the Institute, as many of us have been working with them in this room, when they said that one of the issues they were going to be looking at with us was the interplay between politicians and civil servants. Because if there's one issue we need to work on together, surely it's that one. We can't look to the private sector to fix that problem for us, because they don't employ politicians. We can sort of look to other governments. America's been mentioned, but of course their system is completely different. So we have to fix this issue for ourselves. We have to work on how to make the best of what the Institute calls a dual leadership between politicians and civil servants ourselves. And so what we did together on this was to look at our own experiences in our own departments. And of course, at first sight, it's all pretty straightforward. We advise, they decide, we implement. But of course, in practice, it's a bit more complicated than that. As you said, I was recruited to the Ministry of Justice, their senior team, in 2009, and the job that Suma Chakrabarti gave me was to prepare for the next election. And so he went to Jack Straw, who was the Justice Secretary at the time, and said, would you mind if I took one of my Director Generals and asked him to recruit a team of the most senior people and talented people across the Ministry of Justice to prepare for your successor? And Jack Straw was a very experienced Cabinet Minister who'd been around in 96-7, and he understood that was one of the jobs of the civil service, to prepare for the next government. So he said yes, and so that's what we did. And we did so transparently, and where we identified opportunities to do stuff that was not a matter of debate between politicians, to say shared services, we just got on with it. Where we identified a policy proposition where it was clear that the different political parties shared a common view, we got on with it. So to take one simple example, Jack Straw, as the Justice Secretary, launched the Payment by Results programme, which Chris Grayling has just extended. Where, though, we were identifying policy choices that different political parties had different views on, it was our job as civil servants to prepare different options depending on who it was that we worked for. Just as important as that, of course, it was our job to prepare the organisation for whatever was coming down the track. We didn't know precisely what the policy solutions were going to be, but we knew there was a significant financial crisis coming, that we knew by the end of the Parliament there would be many fewer people working for the Ministry of Justice than there had been at the beginning, and so we went round prisons, courts and the rest of it, preparing people for that, seeking their ideas, being as open as we could about what was coming down the track. And so, yeah, it was surprising after the election, when we got Ken Clarke, to find that he didn't want to change the brand, Transforming Justice. I guess he didn't, because he saw it simply as a machine that enabled him to achieve what he wanted. The more significant development was the fact that in the year in which we announced the prison closures, the court closure programme, the reduction in staff numbers by 25%, the employee engagement score of the Ministry of Justice went up, which I think was because of the preparation that had been done, the engagement between senior manager and staff about what was coming down the track. So that was our experience in justice. In defence, that model wouldn't have worked. In defence, the reality was that the incoming Defence Secretary, Liam Fox, was very clear that he was going to lead the reform of the Ministry of Defence himself, and that that's what he wanted to do, and that was what was required. Equally, he wanted to work closely with senior civil servants, the senior military, and he wanted some external advisors to work with him too on what was the right answer. And so for him, the perfect model turned out to be the one that Francis Maude and Lord Brown brought into government, the departmental board, bringing together senior ministers, senior executives, civilian and military in our case, senior non-executives, to wrestle with some really difficult questions like, how do you reduce the size of the army by 20%? How do you manage the workforce? Where's the best way of bringing in the private sector? And that's been, in our experience, defence, a tremendously impressive way in which the most senior people have worked together on trying to tackle some difficult problems, and have, to take one practical example, been able to balance the equipment programme in the Ministry of Defence out to 2020, a task that had been beyond them previously. And now they're able to set a sort of clear sense of direction for the organisation ahead. And so, in conclusion, and building on the point I made at the beginning, that we can learn enormously from each other's efforts, my tip for today from the Ministry of Defence is make the most of your departmental board. We all know, don't we, that achieving sustained transformational change requires a guiding coalition at the top of any organisation if it is to succeed. Of course, ministers and civil servants have different roles. In the end, they decide, we get on, do it. But creating a forum which brings them together, advised, supported, challenged by some of the most experienced non-executives in the country, creating senior leadership teams greater than the sum of the parts, what better way than that to try and help us confront and make progress on some of the most difficult, important challenges that any of us are going to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. That was absolutely fascinating. It's an interesting quiz question. What have Igor Judge and David Richards got in common? Whether they view it that way is a challenge you've had to face. Bob, it's particularly glad to have Bob Kerslake here, because this actually is a classic illustration of his dual role, his experience as a departmental permanent secretary and as head of the civil service, bringing it together. Bob.
Absolutely right. As my Secretary of State calls me 2 jobs Bob. That's my, and he's very proud of this joke, so it's important that you use it whenever you laugh at the right point. Look, I think the first thing to start with here is to say this report is very welcome, and it's a timely reminder of the scale of the change that we're undertaking, which I think is the biggest challenge the civil service has experienced since the Second World War. I don't think that is an understatement of what we're trying to do here. And the reason I say that is that we are trying to do 2 things at the same time. We're trying to deliver a massive programme of change and reform that the government has instituted, whether it's welfare, whether it's the prisons, whether it's defence, at the same time as we're undergoing a huge process of reform and change ourselves. And it's those twin tasks that make this such a big and ambitious agenda that we're facing. What I'd say, though, is that we should not think that we are alone in this. It's really important not to see the civil service as the sole recipient of this programme of change. If you go to local government, they have seen a reduction in their grant of 1/4 over the period of the spending review. If you look at the police, if you look at health, even with sustained funding, there's massive change going on here. And of course in the private sector we're seeing huge changes, huge industrial changes going on at the moment. So we're not alone in this period of change and transformation. And it's quite important to remember that. What I think marks out the civil service, though, is our willingness to be subject to external review and challenge, and for that to be published. That's, I think, what marks us out. You will, I don't think, see this anywhere else across any sector, public and private. And personally, I welcome that, because one of the keys to success on this agenda will be honest assessment of how far we've got and how far we need to go. So I think it's worth recognising that it's a sign of strength for the civil service to be open to review and challenge, not a sign of weakness. The other thing I'd say is that this is not just happening to us, and it's not the first time that organisations have gone through this scale of change. My background was as Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council for 12 years. When I went to Sheffield City Council, I said to the leader, where the advert talked about being open to change, willing to change, wanting to change, what is it you want to change? And he said, everything. The council was in complete meltdown. Financially, in terms of its morale, everything. And yet within 8 years it achieved Council of the Year. So you can deliver these turnaround processes, but they're not easy, they're not straightforward, and they're not quick. And the things I learnt about how change happens and happens well very much chime with the themes of the IFG report. Because the change we're going through here is both departmental and cross-civil service. If you look at the reform plan, there's big changes in that. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when you look at the scale of the change going on in departments. And the trick here is to find a process of change where those two things complement and support each other. That what we're seeking to do for the Civil Service Reform Plan enhances and sustains and supports what departments are trying to do through the changes that they're making. And that's the kind of trick we're trying to pull off in this process of change. The things that I think marked out our change in Sheffield were these, really. First of all, an absolutely clear sense of where we wanted to get. We wanted to be the best managed council. At the time we started it, it looked ridiculous. By the time we finished it, it looked absolutely possible. The second thing is to have strong, visible corporate leadership. So there is one sense of a one council approach. The third thing is to have incredible resilience to overcome the barriers that you are inevitably going to face and the setbacks. And there will be setbacks, there have been setbacks in this process of change, we'll get more of them. The test is not whether you get those things going wrong, but how you respond to them when they do go wrong. And I think the last thing is you need a very powerful and strong sense of organisation and programme and purpose about what you're doing. One of my favourite phrases is that the victory of ideals must be organised. The only problem is it was Lenin who said it, which may not be part of the recognised canon of management theory at the moment. But actually the point he was making there is right, really. A large part of success here is being rigorous, clear and focused in your process of delivery of the change, because you can carry managers with you in that process if they know where you're trying to go and how you're trying to get there. If they're not clear about either of those things, you're very rarely going to get them to get behind the cultural change. So for me, we can draw on lessons. That's my personal lesson. Jonathan will have personal lessons, others will have it in the civil service, that will tell us that it's both possible and indeed eminently deliverable to achieve what we're trying to do here. It's not an impossible challenge, but it will require clear determination and focus to do it. I wanted to, in a sense, come back to the three risks you raised, because that's at the core of your paper, I think. And all of those, I think, are important risks that we should recognise and respond to. And I hope in a way that the plan, the reform plan, does that. The first one was about fragile leadership. I'm very, very clear in my mind that what we're now trying to do cannot be done by departments in isolation. It is absolutely clear that the scale of what we're doing does require, must Absolutely is imperative to what we're doing, that this is done as a cross-cutting corporate approach. Now, the tricky bit in doing that is that the culture of the civil service, at least for quite a long time, has been a federal model. And that federal model grew up in a reaction to a centralised model. So the question is, can you find a corporate model where we get engaged leadership, we do the right things across the civil service, whilst not stifling what inevitably has to be differences, taking Jonathan's point, between, say, MOD and MOJ. It's that balance that we're trying to strike in our corporate leadership. It's why we've created a civil service board that provides permanent secretary leadership. It's why we have a top 200 that will be meeting this Friday to review progress in a very practical way. It's why we've developed reform champions and cross-Whitehall groups leading themes within the plan. So absolutely part of the deal here, to me, is that we have to have corporate leadership cross-Whitehall and seek the opportunities that come from that. And they're not just about efficiencies of scale, which is the thing that people most quote. Shared services are important. We'll take that a lot further than it's gone already. But the really powerful thing about a unified civil service is it finds the best and it makes it the standard. That's the most powerful improvement model that we can use, it seems to me. The civil service has many examples of excellence. I go up and down the country pretty much every week, seeing what's happening on the ground, and you will find pockets of real brilliance out there, as good as anything you'll see in any part of any sector. Our challenge is it's not consistently there. We have places that are brilliant at programme management, but we don't have enough places that are good at programme management. We have places that are good at performance management, but we don't have enough places that are consistently good at it. And the civil service hangs together, or it hangs separately, really. We're as good as the worst part of our performance. So a key part of the improvement agenda, a key part of the corporate model, has to be a unified civil service that finds the best and then applies that across the whole of the civil service. And I think it is absolutely an opportunity both to de-risk the change process and move forward faster. The second theme that you talked about, I think, was this issue about how do we build a sustainable coalition when there's a high level of churn and change that's going on. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, and I wouldn't want to give you a glib one. But I do think one of the ways that we do that is to place incentives on those people occupying key positions of change. One of the things the reform plan says is that where we have people locked into major projects, major initiatives, we will reward them for staying in that role and delivering what we're looking for, rather than saying the reward comes only if you move to another role. So part of this is about building in stability to the processes of change. But I think the second bit of the process is that if we have wide involvement and engagement from the leadership, then the model doesn't rely on one or two people being there all the way through this process. Actually, in any organisation, you get change. When I look back to my Sheffield City Council example, I think we went through at least 4 changes of administration, from Labour to Lib Dem to Hung to Labour. Actually, it was 5, and then back to Labour again. The key thing there was that we had got a shared sense of the mission that survived those political changes, and we didn't rely on individuals as the only way of driving change. There has to be a widespread engagement, understanding of what the change programme is, and that, I think, gives us the resilience that we need in this period. I don't think we can rely on people staying in roles forever. We can incentivise it. We need strength in depth. And the last risk you raise is around staff engagement, and as you rightly say, the staff survey results will tell us about where we are now in that process of change. And we know that civil servants have experienced flat salaries, reductions in pensions, reductions in numbers of staff. And all of these have had some impact on the way staff feel. But we also know that they don't believe that we get the process of leading change right. And that's why one of the key things we're going to invest in is strengthening our ability to lead change. It will be a priority for the development of management. because we know there are good ways and bad ways of doing that, and we know that some parts of the civil service get it right and some don't. So I think it's a key agenda for us, and it's a personal test for me of all of my managers in CLG of how well they've maintained engagement during this period of change. It's got to be, in a sense, how we test the effectiveness of managers, not just what they deliver in their jobs, but how they deliver it and how they sustain motivation, engagement in change. I also think very strongly that this change process isn't about people simply pedalling faster on the hamster wheel. If we do that, at some point, bits of the organisation will fall over. You have to look fundamentally at the model of how you operate as a department, as a service. You can't do it simply by stripping back and hoping for the best. In the case of CLG, there was a fundamental re-examination of how much the department did and how much the department sought to control and manage, as opposed to how much local government did on its own behalf. Decentralisation, localisation is both good in its own terms, but it actually reduced the demands on the department itself. In other departments, HMRC, a big commitment, investment in things like digital technology to drive savings. And one of the things we're going to do as part of the reform plan is to ask each department, what is their change model? How are they seeking to deliver what they have to deliver within fewer resources? And that's a key test for us, for each department. Can they identify the change in their processes that will deliver the scale of change they're trying to do in the numbers of staff? So part of the engagement agenda is that we can persuade staff that it is possible to do things with fewer staff and do them differently and better. That is the absolute challenge we have. Otherwise, in a period where we're likely to see, I think, retrenchment and consolidation for up to a decade, people will simply lose faith in the process of change. There has to be both changes in the numbers, changes in the skills, and changes in the way individual departments deliver their business. Just let me finish as a last point, and the question you might ask is, what would give you hope that we can get this right? The thing that gives me most hope, I have to say, is the experience I get talking to staff about why they work for the civil service in the first place. And the things they like about it is the nature of the work they have, the excitement of the work they have, the variation of the work they do, and the fact that they make a difference. What we now need to do is to build on those traditional strengths of the civil service and add other things as well. The commitment to being a flexible employer, the commitment to developing staff's talent, the commitment to being a skilled civil service that consistently performs as well as any in the world. And I think if we do that, we'll keep staff motivated and we'll deliver this very ambitious programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob, for that. Thank you for those complimentary contributions. I'd just like to begin, before opening it up to questions, and could I just say this is an on-the-record occasion for that, and I say we are, it's on Twitter, #CivilService. Could I begin taking up a point Jonathan made? Obviously crucial to justice was Jack Straw's backing and the political backing for the change programme, not only just over the election, but subsequently to that. And then you, Jonathan, you talked about Liam Fox's approach and so on. How important, Bob, is this, I mean, talking about dual leadership, the political backing for what is being done by the civil service?
I think it's absolutely crucial, and it's why when we developed the reform plan, we put a lot of effort into getting support amongst ministers as well as amongst permanent secretaries. There has to be support with equal kind of strength from both the politicians and the officials, in my view. And that's why it was taken to full cabinet, and there was a pretty long debate about the plan before it was finalised. That buy-in's needed for the civil service reform plan, but it's needed in departments as well. And the reasons why it's particularly important is that any change programme hits a rough patch at some point, where you're not quite sure whether you're going forwards or backwards, where you're getting flack from the press and outside. And if you haven't got the political buy-in, then that's the point at which the thing starts to crumble. You absolutely have to have the buy-in to the change programme you're trying to achieve. And I think it's fair to say, if you look at individual departments, that's been the case. That I look at my own department, there was very clear buy-in from ministers to the process. I look at other departments, similarly the case. It's vital. You really can't deliver what we're trying to do without both of them being on side.
There's the other factor which Jonathan mentioned, which is of course a new one since the election, is a different role of departmental boards and of the new generation of non-executive directors, whose role seems to be expanding. I mean, we obviously see it at present in what's happening with the inquiry in the Department of Transport, but within several departments, the role of the NEDs is something quite new compared with pre-2010.
Yeah, I think that's right. When this was first proposed, it wouldn't be, I think, wrong to say that a number of Perm Secs weren't entirely convinced, to be truthful. They might even have been sceptical about it. But actually, I think it's been a terrific additional resource. I really do. And I think I don't think there'd be any Perm Sec now who doesn't see the value of having that non-exec advice to the process, both for ministers, but actually to Perm Secs as well. And I think the principal reason why it works actually is the calibre of the people we're getting as non-execs. If you just look across their CVs, you see people who've been there and done it. They've done big things in big organisations. So they know what the task is, if you see what I mean. And secondly, I think there's been quite a lot of work done, particularly by Lord Brown, to clarify what their role is and what their role isn't. They're not there to set policy, they're not there to set priorities. They are there to provide scrutiny, challenge and support to this very big change programme that we're undertaking. So I think they're a force for good, and I think they've been a real additional asset in that process of change.
Jonathan, do you want to comment on this at all?
Well, yeah, that certainly was. That's certainly been my experience. I referred to it in defence, and similarly in justice, where we were doing it from scratch. To take one practical example, we were having to work out how to cope with 25-30% fewer policymakers, policy officials, the people who ministers look to develop their agenda for them. And how are we going to succeed in reducing the number of policymakers by 30% if we couldn't agree that we were going to do at least 20-25% less policy, however much more efficiently we might do it? Bringing together senior ministers with policy officials and an external challenge. Here are the range of policies we could be working on in the coming year. Which of the last 25% we're going to drop? Was a process that the departmental board away day, chaired by Ken Clark, was perfectly attuned to accomplish.
Now, I want to interrupt questions. There are a lot of people here with lots of experience and so on. I'm going to take them in kind of two or three. Could you say who you are for the sake of the panel? I know, and in most cases I know who you are, but it's just to say that we know there will be mics around on that. I think the gentleman there.
Nick Sharman, I'm chair the CBI's local government panel, and both Jonathan and Bob have made powerful cases for integrated change management. But I wonder whether we're not also, it's important also to look at the framing, another framing issue, which is the need for Whitehall itself to work together on outcomes across the board. And I'm thinking particularly, Bob, from the local authority point of view, the fragmented nature of interaction with Whitehall. So the integration argument comes around service delivery and new models of service delivery as much as the internal change mechanisms. And I'm just conscious of the Troubled Families Initiative, how long that took, which was a genuinely joined up Whitehall initiative. It took a long time to achieve that, and whether the sort of models that you've talked about will be able to achieve that much more smoothly over the next period.
We'll take a second question. Christina, sorry, Mike will come round to you.
Hello, I'm Christina Dykes. I'm an associate of the Institute for Government. I also do some work in local government and in central government. And that's where my question is going to be in local government. I worked in a large London borough where they were instituting a PIP, a large management consultancy came in to institute a PIP, Performance Improvement Plan. And it was very slick, they were doing very well, they were cutting out a lot of costs and this, that and the other. But it came to a sort of sticky sort of middle bit because the politicians weren't taken with them. And it seems in all the discussions so far, we've rather left the politicians to one side. And I'm very reminded of the frankness and bravery and honesty of Estelle Morris, who, when she resigned as Secretary of State for Education, said, "I knew how to be a teacher. I could talk to the press, but no one taught me how to run a department." That still seems to be the case.
Right. Bob.
Right. The first question was about working really part of a whole system with local government as well. I think it's absolutely right. I think we've got a long way to go on that. We're trying to move that forward in the community budget work that David Prout is leading, who's here today. And actually I think some very interesting, exciting ideas are coming out of that work, which essentially looks at the whole system in a place, particularly health and care, and says, how if you made that system work differently, could you deliver savings and sustain outcomes, really? That's a key test here. So I think there's a lot in this, and I think we've got to be very relentless in pushing a different way of doing things here. You could also argue, if you read the Heseltine report, Michael Heseltine's report, that's also a theme he has there as well, about how well we collaborate. I personally think it's less about structures than it is about culture, and it goes back to my point about a unified civil service. If the default was always to work collaboratively around a common issue, if the natural instinct was to do that, you wouldn't have to completely reorganise Whitehall to get that joined up thinking. It's because we're working against, it's countercultural that it proves so hard, actually. My personal view is that troubled families happen as an initiative pretty rapidly, actually. I think Casey's done a terrific job getting it up and running, and more crucially getting a lot of local authority buy-in to it as well. But it was quite a struggle, and actually what carried it through some difficult points was the championship of the Prime Minister. And my test would be, how do we get those joined up approaches without always relying on the Prime Minister to drive them, I think. And then just the last question about ministers and the management of departments. I 100%, as I said earlier, said you've got to get ministers to buy into the change that you're trying to achieve, it seems to me. I don't think that means you rely on them to make the change. I think they should rightly look to permanent secretaries to deliver that change on their behalf. But they have to have been part of the thinking of what you're trying to do, because, as I said, for two reasons really. One is, at some point along the way something will go wrong, and you need them to back you, basically, and help you through that difficult period. That's one part of it. But secondly, when you're changing the organisation of the department, it will impact on the policy. It's absolutely driven by the policies that they're trying to deliver. And unless you've got that relationship right, it's not going to work. So you've got to get their buy-in. I don't think they have to become the managers. I think they have to understand the management task, what you're trying to do. It's a different thing.
That's a bit worrisome.
Well, I personally think it's difficult for me to make a general answer to that. But from what I've seen so far, and I talk to Secretaries of State, and we do mid-year reviews, annual reviews of permanent secretaries. I talk to the ministers. Pretty consistently, they are aware of what's happening and supportive of what's happening in their departments.
Jonathan, do you want to go and talk?
In the case of defence, one of the most interesting reforms of use to us of a cross-departmental nature has been the National Security Council and the infrastructure that supports that, bringing together the work of the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, in a way that wasn't always true before. That really has driven a lot of the delivery that we do, so that's been a very interesting example of cross-departmental working that is making a big difference to us. In the Ministry of Justice, we had our contribution to make to David's work on troubled families, where we were looking to incentivise local government, indeed the police, to keep people out of prison. We need to give them the money to save us the cost, and that was easier said than done, but I think we played an active role in it as we could. My experience working for Judge Straw, I've already referred to, where he gave us the space to do what we needed to do. I've worked for Liam Fox and for Philip Hammond in defence, both of them very different people, both of them giving me all the leadership I needed to drive forward the agenda. I suppose perhaps I would say that I'm a serving civil servant, but that's what I've found while I've been here.
But can I take up one of Christina's points? We've done a lot of work here on ministerial effectiveness. One of the most striking things is how few ministers have ever worked in large organisations. This is not a private sector point, it's large organisations. And therefore, most of them are small businesses. The expenses rather showed that. But they've never actually worked in big organisations. Therefore, it's not, I found the interesting point when we talked to them is the lack of awareness. And also being, at one stage, and from what you said, Bob, you're overcoming that, the almost shying away from organisational problems because they're unfamiliar with them.
I think actually you were talking earlier about the non-execs. That's often a place where they can play quite a powerful role because they're speaking from that experience of doing this. And very often ministers will hear that alongside, if it's reinforced and supported by the permanent secretary.
Yeah, no, I think that's changing, but certainly it has been, very few. Right, two there, and that right there.
Alan Evans, Scotland office. One of the points James mentioned but wasn't actually picked up, and yet everyone talked about the importance of leadership led by the permanent secretary, is that only in the Treasury and DCMS is the same leader in place as was there at the general election. Some perm secretaries have got rid of, some have been moved on for other reasons, some have gone elsewhere. How much of a concern is it about the need to have stable leadership and continual leadership to see this process through across all departments, given the amount of churn there's been in the last 2 years?
Alistair Smith from the Senior Salaries Review Body. It's several years since David Normington launched a process of reforming senior civil service pay, but that process seems to have got becalmed. Do you think that this process of transformational change can be delivered on an unreformed SCS pay system?
Well, two interesting questions there for you, Bob.
Blimey. Right, how do we think about those two? On the first one, of course you would want to keep the turnover down, Alan. There's always quite a turnover post an election, as you know. A number of perm secs will carry over the election and then go. But not leaving that to one side, yes, there's been quite a big turnover. It goes to my point earlier that whilst that is something you want to keep to a minimum, I think you can sustain a change programme if you've got strength in depth and if you've got buy-in not just from the permanent secretaries but actually from the level below that and the level below that. It's why we invest a lot of effort in the development of the top cadre DGs and indeed directors, because we have to have strength in depth, because we will face periods of turnover, hopefully not as big as we've had recently, but we will face it. I think on the salaries issue, it's right to say that if we look at the salaries, we calculate that the real salary of senior people has probably fallen between 15 and 20% since the election for senior people. So they've certainly played their part in delivering reduced costs here. The question we've got in a sense about reform, I think, is where's the priority? We aren't going to sort everything out that you might want to sort out in salaries, and I personally don't think we should even try and compete with private sector salaries, because it's a completely mug's game, frankly. When you look at the numbers, you're miles away. So I think myself, if we're going to look at the issue of senior salaries, we should focus on very specific issues of gaps, issues of inconsistency between people, how the bonus and performance schemes work, rather than some whole-scale reform, which I think is not going to happen anytime soon and is not going to be affordable. Do I think we can deliver within the current framework? Yes, I do, actually, because I don't think salary alone is the key driver for many senior civil servants. What drives them is the interest and the focus of the job. We have to live with that as being the principal driver of people. So I think it's targeted change rather than whole-scale reform, and I think it's perfectly possible to deliver what we have to do within that.
Right. Yep, we've got David Simon then. No, behind you, then you, and then we'll take those three together.
David Simon, Lord Brown's predecessor, and briefly Minister. I'm really fascinated by looking at it over a 12-year period where one's been interested in reform of the civil service, starting with modernising government, joined up government, which you'll remember. And listening to you and Jonathan, there has been an enormous difference in the approach to process, how you go about change, and methodology, and togetherness, if I can just leave it under that umbrella. What struck me briefly reading the report is the phrase, in comparison with the private sector, in contrast, the public sector lacks an overall measure of value equivalent to profit. So that brings me to the question of the other half of the problem of change, which is why. I think you've been absolutely brilliant on how, and very different to what I've heard over a decade. But why do you have to change in the civil service? Seems to me to way to get at the hearts and minds of the people. And you knew what you did in Sheffield will be the best, but I'm not sure how you do that with government. Could you explain a bit about the why? Why do you think you'll get buy-in for change? Because telling people you're going to cut costs by 20% doesn't work. And I just don't understand the why yet for you.
Well, let's take that one on its own, then I'll come to the others. Johnson,
as you say, unless you're clear why you're trying to change an organisation, why should anybody want to come with you on the journey? That doesn't mean you shouldn't be very clear about the financial constraints you operate within, and you do need to be, honest to where you're going to be losing staff and manage accordingly. In the case of the job I did in justice, we used the phrase better for less. We thought it was possible to secure better justice at a cheaper price, that if we speeded up the efficiency of the court process, it would be cheaper, there would be fewer people working in it, and it would be better because people would be brought to justice more quickly. If we could reduce reoffending, that would be better for the public, obviously, and it would be cheaper for the Ministry of Justice. We didn't claim that everything could be better for less, because if you're going to try and reduce costs by 25% in 4 years, you're going to have to make some choices between competing priorities. And so you need to be honest about what can be better and what you're doing simply as a consequence of the financial circumstances you are in, and you're making choices about what you can prioritise and what you can't. And if you're open and transparent about that, my experience has been that you can take people with you. In the case of defence, our story is that the Ministry of Defence hasn't in the past spent the money that it's been given by the Treasury as well as it might to secure the best possible national security that £35 billion a year can pay for, and that there are too many bureaucratic processes that get in the way, or a failure to make decisions between competing priorities, whether that's the number of tanks or frigates or planes, a failure to make decisions about those competing priorities in the past has led people to hope that somebody would come along with a solution, and in the meantime people are wasting money on designing programs that are never going to get delivered. And if we can be more honest and open up front, and the board can take tough decisions now, then we'll put better use to our money, we'll put our money to better use, and the people who are being asked to deliver this for us will be doing jobs that are capable of being achieved, as opposed to jobs where they're being asked to do too much. I was struck when I arrived in the Ministry of Defence that programme managers were often getting blamed for the fact that programmes took too long and cost too much. And that was because of decisions that hadn't been taken several years ago to give them a task that was actually accomplishable. And so that's a message you can give people, that you can take people with you on.
Bob?
Yeah, I've got three reasons why. The first is that the world is changing and we need to change with it. Government is facing, the challenges we're facing in the UK are not unique. Every part of the Western world is going through consolidation, it's facing the challenges of a less deferential public and so on. So there's a whole set of changes, environmental, social, financial, that demand a change in the way we work if we're going to survive and prosper. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that we have, in my view, many strengths in the civil service, but some systemic weaknesses that mean we don't, in a sense, do ourselves justice. So when a project goes wrong because of poor project management, that doesn't just damage the area where the project's gone wrong, it damages the reputation of the whole of the civil service. So the second reason why we need to change is because we still have, notwithstanding our great strengths, some systemic weaknesses that are not, and some inconsistencies, I guess the way to describe it. The third reason why actually is because we can create a better civil service, not just in delivering ministers' ambitions, but for the people who work in it. If you go around the country and talk to civil servants and ask them what frustrates them, they'll say to you the fragmentation, they'll say the IT doesn't work terribly well, they'll say we work in a hierarchical culture, they'll say that they've got good ideas for improvement and they don't get listened to, they'll say that the people who underperform get away with it, and the people who perform well don't get recognised. And if we can tackle those things, we don't just, in a sense, make the civil service better for ministers, we make it better for civil servants as well. And that's got to be part of the story, it seems to me.
Okay, now, question there. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Alex Plant. I work at Cambridgeshire County Council, leading a major transformation programme there. First question is a very quick observation, which was when, James, you were talking rightly at the beginning about Whitehall being different to private sector, and you were reflecting on the issues of managing in a political environment, very rapid diminution in funds available. What was screaming at me as I was hearing you was that's exactly the situation the local government is facing, and Bob's points, I think, reinforced that. So as you take this excellent report forward, I think there's a local government link to be made. My background before moving to local government is in Whitehall and Treasury, and I suppose my second question goes to some of what Bob was saying, and it's this. Bob, you talked about the federal structure of Whitehall and the difficulty of government departments in not joining up. And I went through the joined up government story from when I was a baby civil servant, and it's never changed, really. I mean, there's been some successes, but they've been very marginal. My question is this. If you really want to drive a radical difference of approach and not just do more salami slicing, which I think has run its course for what we're at, you actually need to change fundamentally the way that the money works. If Treasury is doling out to departments and holding departments to account, and the NAO and the Public Accounts Committee do the same, it will always default back to an element of defensiveness amongst the relevant permanent secretary and his department. So if what David's doing on community budgets could really be pushed to its logical end point, you would actually shift completely the way that you account for and are held to account for the spending of budgets. Now that's very radical, and I just wonder whether there's appetite for it, because it could deliver the outcome focus that my colleague in front of me started the first question with.
Thanks. There's a question along there, and then there's one there and there's one here. Well,
thank you. I'd just like to build on Alex's point. This question about a more radical approach to joining up Whitehall, I think, is an absolutely central one for all the reasons we've discussed. What role do you see for the non-executives in Whitehall in terms of pushing some radical ideas?
And two rows in front of you.
Thank you. Chris Bingham, a leader of the central government practice at Atos. I wanted to pick up on James's point about shared services, where you pointed out in headline terms that in your report there's been a disappointing level of shared services progress across Whitehall. I think I'd emphasise that point. As somebody that spends all my time looking at central government, I would concur. There's been a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of progress. Question, therefore, is the sharing of services between departments dead? Is the rhetoric over? Is the acting over? And is the sharing of services more profound and more important within departments where there seems to be still a lot of joining up to be done in the very big Whitehall departments?
Right, and the final one here.
Thank you very much. Kate Jenkins. Just a couple of points. I do think the question about the money and how it's handled, which somebody further back made, is a very important one. I mean, this is very, very interesting, and it's fascinating to hear the way in which things are being tackled now. Presumably, primarily, in a context which is there isn't the money there was before, and we therefore have to think of a new way of doing things. I mean, I assume that's pretty well what you're doing. But I think to think about how the money influences what you do seems to me to be extremely important. And if what one has is the, with all due respect to those from the Treasury in the room, the traditional process of handling money, which is very much input-driven, I think some extremely careful thinking about what could be done in those areas could make an enormous amount of difference, because the amount of money that's wasted because of the way money is spent can be very significant indeed. Second point I wanted to pick up, which is about you're describing a very different organisation, and I've shared the experience of joining up over a very long period of time. But I think what I would find very interesting is what you think the civil service is going to be like that emerges from this. Because it sounds as though the pressures are going to be very different, the skills are going to be very different, the professionalism may be very different, and I'd just very much like to know what your image is of what this new civil service would look like.
That is a very interesting final question, Kate. If we can do it, Jonathan, Bob, and then I'll bring in James to conclude the event. Jonathan.
As others have said, certainly there's plenty that we can learn from local government. I spent the first half of my career in local government, and as I manage redundancy programmes now, I'm very much reminded of the work I used to do in local government in the 1990s. Equally, maybe local government has been completely transformed since I worked in it, but I sort of seem to remember a certain amount of departmentalism in those days, where the Directors of Education and Social Services, I mean, I know those posts don't exist in quite the same way, weren't always on exactly the same page when it came to allocating the money out between departments. So presumably, it's complicated when there's a finite sum of money to be allocated across a diverse range of people with demands to place upon it. Not to say, though, that there isn't plenty of experience that we can draw from. But to give you a sense of the challenge, when I worked in Ministry of Justice, it was during the spending review, and the Treasury did come to us and said they wanted to look at a criminal justice system approach to the spending review. And how easy do you think the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, and the Crown Prosecution Service found it to agree amongst the three of us where the savings should fall? So you can't just blame the Treasury for this, of course, can you? It's quite a complicated task. There are, of course, improvements that we are making. You can use the department as a measure if you want, but the shared service agenda that I'm driving at the moment is driving shared services across the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. We're doing shared services across those three. And we're an organisation that turns over, as I said earlier, about £35 billion a year. So you might think that's a sufficient economy of scale for us to do shared services. When I was in the Ministry of Justice, we were providing shared services to the Home Office. So these things can be done. But one department is different from another, and the crucial question is where you can get the right economy of scale. And then just a very different example of cross-departmentalism. Yesterday I was in a meeting of Directors General across Whitehall, commissioned by Bob's Senior Leadership Committee to look at the most talented directors across departments in Whitehall and work out where they should best be placed in Whitehall in light of the challenges that we faced. A very different model of recruiting talent to posts than you might imagine. So not to say that there isn't much more that we could be doing, but there's some interesting stuff going on.
Bob.
Yeah, I absolutely share the view about learning from local government. I'm delighted that Catherine Kurzweil is heading up the civil service reform process, who has, I won't say as much experience as me in local government, but a lot anyway. So I think there's absolutely a lot we can learn from local government. What's interesting for me is that central government pushed local government into a more corporate model with the introduction of cabinets and scrutiny and all that. And it genuinely changed the way a lot of local government, certainly the best of local government, worked, moving away from kind of committee chairs and fragmented leadership. But the really odd thing is, having imposed that change on local government, I came into central government and it hadn't done it to itself. That was the... So I think there is a learning part. I won't say everything in local government is perfect, but they have definitely moved to a much more coherent, joined-up approach to how they do things. I think the money point is right. One of the projects that you're doing in the IFG is around managing across budgets, actually. How do we deliver the next spending review across budgets? It's got the Treasury involved in that. It's got departments involved in that at a senior level. So I'm really hopeful we'll learn something from that piece of work, because you're absolutely right to say, unless you get to the heart of the money, which is what we're trying to do for community budgets, this always falls down. And the phrase that's used by, I think it's Manchester, is that the fruits of one person's labour fall in another person's garden. That's their kind of mantra. So there's no incentive in the system to drive out the savings. And I think it is about following the money. It is about signalling that we're up for that. I don't think it's just about Treasury, though. So if I give you an illustration, CLG talks to Treasury about local government. Department of Health talks to the Treasury about care. There's no reason why CLG and Health can't talk together about local government and care and then talk to the Treasury. We just haven't done it that way. And I think we just have to... So some of this is cultural barriers rather than Treasury barriers or system barriers, if you see what I mean. Second question was about non-execs and what they can bring to it. And I think the most powerful thing non-execs do is ask the obvious question, because usually we haven't got a very good answer for it in the civil service. So some of it is saying, a lot of it is saying, I can't see why you do it this way, because you'll spot those things in a way we don't. And I think just keep the challenge going is the important thing, and not be, diverted by us saying, well, we've always done it that way. The most powerful thing is that ability to ask the question about why something is done the way it is, because you lose sight of it, don't you? I mean, the strength, the civil service has a culture that's so ingrained that nobody sees it. It's just there. So the power of the non-execs is their ability to, if you like, put a mirror up and say, we don't see why you do it this way. The third thing about shared service is definitely on the agenda. To say it's been slow would be kind. When I first came on to ODPM as a non-exec, different kind of non-exec then, this was probably a decade ago, the department, CLG, was talking about shared services. I come back as PermSec, and damn me if they're not still talking about shared services. But we are absolutely going to do it this time. The contract is already being let for one of the shared service hubs for transactional services. We've just come to an agreement with the key departments for a second hub of shared services. That will cover the transactional services, the finance, IT and so on. I've recently just written round to say we'll have a single legal services, and they will be then outposted in departments. So we are moving, I think, at a much faster pace on this, and we're embracing and looking at whether we should have shared services on policy as well, actually. So I think it is now seriously moving, and there's a very high level of commitment at political level and at official level to see this happen this time. We really are going to see it through. The final question about the future, so do you want me to cover that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think what we're looking for is a civil service that's going to be definitely smaller, that is more strategic. It does the things that central government can and should do, and consciously asks the question about whether others can do it rather than central government. It uses different tools to deliver change. It won't be about putting more money in and more targets and regulation. It'll be about co-producing and delivering shared solutions in the way that we're trying to do through the Troubled Families Initiative. It'll be a civil service where we've consistently built on the skills we have and tackled the known weaknesses, commercial, digital, the program and project management and the leadership. So we would have, in a sense, addressed those key structural weaknesses in our skills. It'll definitely be much more strongly and corporately led. The default won't be standalone departments. The default will be departments that share services across a wide range of things. And then the last bit, but not least, it will be a civil service that people feel proud to work for, and has built on the things that people already like about the services and added a few more to it in the way I described earlier.
Thanks. James, to wrap up.
Well, just to add a few quick thoughts on that. I mean, on local government, Alex, your point, we have involved a few chief executives from local government, absolutely, because I think there are some fantastic stories out there for us to learn from. And I think, as Bob was saying, civil service could learn an awful lot from local government. I think one of the interesting differences is actually in the politics. So having steady kind of council and relationships across that is actually one of the things that's quite interesting. And possibly makes things a bit more stable and a bit easier in local government to some extent. Doesn't explain the whole thing, and there's an awful lot to learn. On the money, I mean, we talked in the open letter, Peter, you mentioned the spending review and sorting all of that, but I think it's absolutely right that it's how to get departments to overcome some of the disincentives. And I think it also links up with the shared services point, which is you could take shared services simply as kind of the transactional services and link those up. Actually, you could take that much further. Does it need to be only transactional services that become service hubs? There are other things that we could share across, and that would actually go to the heart of some of the capabilities across departments. And then just on the future of the civil service, and it goes back to the point about the why and what would be better about it. I think that's absolutely essential to tackling the staff engagement point. And not just for staff at non-SES levels across civil service, but also keeping the leadership energy up. This isn't something that's just draining for staff at the lower levels who find it hard. Actually keeping the leadership teams together and working together is absolutely essential. And that feeds back into your point, Bob, about the corporately led and having the strength and depth.
Good, thank you, Dave. I mean, can I just underline two final points before I ask you to thank the panel? One, whilst this is a culmination of work over 4 years, it's really a kind of a pause before we move on to further work. Because Bob mentioned the work we're doing on some cross-cutting work. We had a very interesting workshop on this earlier a few weeks ago, and we want to take that forward, working with the Treasury. I think the Treasury here is obviously incognito tonight. But we do want to take that forward equally with the departmental transformation work. One of the keys to the Institute is we don't just produce a report, then go off and do something totally different. We carry on with it, and this is something we'll be doing also in parallel with the work which is happening on civil service reform. We'll take forward these strands consistently. This, in a sense, is a work in progress. We regard it as such. In our role as kind of candid friend, asking questions, challenge, working closely with people like Bob and Jonathan, we regard this as a very important step to make it better known, the work we're doing, but only a step in the continuing dialogue and continuing research and work, producing ideas on that. One I'd mentioned, which was touched on earlier, which is work on ministerial civil service relations. We've also got in parallel a big project on accountability. We're about to produce, in a week or so, a briefing paper we've done on the example of New Zealand and Australia. We're doing this, we didn't ourselves bid for the policy fund, but we're very supportive of the work IPPR is doing, but we've decided to do our own project in our own time, and the first briefing paper will be a very, very interesting one, which is just being finalised, on the examples from New Zealand and Australia, which are absolutely fascinating, on the lessons learned from that, which feeds into a lot of some of the dual leadership points. So I say we remain fully committed to this work ourselves in a range of aspects. I'm just looking around the room at IFG people. A lot of them touch on some of the themes covered tonight. Not just what James has done in his and his team's excellent report, but also a number of other aspects we've done. I'd also very much like to thank Jonathan Slater, Bob Kerslake, for being here tonight, being so open, frank, and also for their participation in all the work which led up to this report, because they were absolutely crucial, and with a lot of other people in this room, were absolutely crucial in producing the report in a way which preserves the right way of doing it and enables candid discussion to happen. So could I join you in asking you to thank the speakers tonight?